And putting on his stiff collar and rebellious tie, he spoke to them, chiding them, and to his dangling watch chain. His hands plunged and rummaged in his trunk, while he called for a clean handkerchief. Agin bite of Inwit. God, we'll simply have to dress the character. I want puce gloves and green boots. Contradiction. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then. I contradict myself. Mercurial Malachy. A limp black missile flew out of his talking hands. And there's your Latin quarter hat, he said. Stephen picked it up and put it on. Haynes called to them from the doorway. Are you coming, you fellows? I'm ready, Buck Mulligan answered, going towards the door. Come out, Kinch. You have eaten all we left, I suppose. Resigned, he passed out with grave words and gait, saying, well nigh with sorrow. And going forth, he met Butterly. Stephen, taking his ash plant from its leaning place, followed them out, and, as they went down the ladder, pulled to the slow iron door and locked it. He put the huge key in his inner pocket. At the foot of the ladder, Buck Mulligan asked, Did you bring the key? I have it, Stephen said, preceding them. He walked on. Behind him he heard Buck Mulligan club with his heavy bath towel the leader shoots of ferns or grasses. Down, sir. How dare you, sir? Haynes asked. Do you pay rent for this tower? 12 quid, Buck Mulligan said. To the Secretary of State for War, Stephen added over his shoulder. They halted while Haynes surveyed the tower and said at last, Rather bleak in wintertime, I should say. Martello, you call it? Billy Pitt had them built, Buck Mulligan said, when the French were on the sea. But ours is the Umphalos. What is your idea of Hamlet? Haynes asked Stephen. No, Buck Mulligan shouted in pain. I'm not equal to Thomas Aquinas and the 55 reasons he has made to prop it up. Wait till I have a few pints in me first. He turned to Stephen, saying as he pulled down neatly the peaks of his primrose waistcoat. You couldn't manage it under 3 pints, Kinch, could you? It has waited so long, Stephen said listlessly. It can wait longer. You pique my curiosity, Haynes said amiably. Is it some paradox? Pooh, Buck Mulligan said. We have grown out of wilds and paradoxes. It's quite simple. He proves by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather, and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. What? Haynes said, and beginning to point at Stephen. He himself? Buck Mulligan slung his towel stolewise around his neck, and, bending in loose laughter, said to Stephen's ear, Oh, shade of Kinch the elder, Japhet in search of a father. We're always tired in the morning, Stephen said to Haynes, and it is rather long to tell. Buck Mulligan, walking forward again, raised his hands. The sacred pint alone can unbind the tongue of Daedalus, he said. I mean to say, Haynes explained to Stephen as they followed, this tower and these cliffs here remind me somehow of Elsinore. That beetles oared his base into the sea, isn't it? Buck Mulligan turned suddenly for an instant towards Stephen, but did not speak. In the bright, silent instant, Stephen saw his own image in cheap, dusty mourning between their gay attires. It's a wonderful tale, Haynes said, bringing them to halt again. Eyes, pale as the sea, the wind had freshened. Paler, firm and prudent. The sea's ruler, he gazed southward over the bay, empty save for the smoke plume of the mailboat. Vague on the bright skyline, and a sail tacking by the Muglins. I read a theological interpretation of it somewhere, he said, bemused. The Father and the Son idea. The Son striving to be atoned with the Father. Buck Mulligan at once put on a blithe, broadly smiling face. He looked at them, his well-shaped mouth open happily, his eyes, from which he had suddenly withdrawn all shrewd sense, blinking with mad gaiety. He moved the doll's head to and fro, the brims of his Panama hat quivering, and began to chant in a quiet, happy, foolish voice. I'm the queerest young fellow that ever you heard. My mother's a Jew, my father's a bird. With Joseph the joiner I cannot agree, so here's to disciples and cavalry. He held up a forefinger of warning. If anyone thinks that I am divine, he'll get no free drinks when I'm making the wine. But he have to drink water and wish it were plain, that I make when the wine becomes water again. He tugged swiftly at Stephen's ash plant in farewell, and, running forward to a brow of the cliff, fluttered his hands at the sides, like fins or wings of one about to rise in the air, and chanted, Goodbye now, goodbye. Write down all I said, and tell Tom, Dick, and Harry I rose from the dead. What's bred in the bone cannot fail me to fly, and Olivate's breezy, goodbye now, goodbye. He capered before them down towards the 40-foot hole, fluttering his wind-like hands, leaping nimbly, Mercury's hat quivering in the fresh wind that bore back to them his brief bird-like cries. Haynes, who had been laughing guardedly, walked on beside Stephen and said, We oughtn't to laugh, I suppose. He's rather blasphemous. I'm not a believer myself, that is to say. Still, his gaiety takes the harm out of it somehow, doesn't it? What did he call it? Joseph the Joiner? The Ballad of Joking Jesus, Stephen answered. Oh, Haynes said, you have heard it before. 3 times a day, after meals, Stephen said dryly. You're not a believer, are you? Haynes asked. I mean, a believer in the narrow sense of the word. Creation from nothing, and miracles and a personal God. There's only one sense of the word, it seems to me, Stephen said. Haynes stopped to take out a smooth silver case in which twinkled a green stone. He sprang it open with his thumb and offered it. Thank you, Stephen said, taking a cigarette. Haynes helped himself and snapped the case too. He put it back in his side pocket and took from his waist pocket a nickel tinderbox. Sprang it open too, and, having lit his cigarette, held the flaming spunk towards Stephen in the shell of his hands. Yes, of course, he said as they went on again. Either you believe or you don't, isn't it? Personally, I couldn't stomach that idea of a personal God. You don't stand for that, I suppose. You behold in me, Stephen said with grim displeasure, a horrible example of free thought. He walked on, waiting to be spoken to, trailing his ash plant by his side. Its ferrule followed lightly on the path, squealing at his heels. My familiar after me, calling Stephen. A wavering line along the path. They will walk on it tonight, coming here in the dark. He wants that key. It is mine. I paid the rent. Now I eat his salt bread. Give him the key too. All. He will ask for it. That was in his eyes. After all, Haynes began. Stephen turned and saw that the cold gaze which had measured him was not all unkind. After all, I should think you are able to free yourself. You're your own master, it seems to me. I am the servant of 2 masters, Stephen said, an English and an Italian. Italian, Haynes said. A crazy queen, old and jealous. Kneel down before me. And a third, Stephen said. There is who wants me for odd jobs. Italian, Haynes said again? What do you mean? The Imperial British State, Stephen answered, his color rising, and the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church. Haynes detached from his underlip some fibers of tobacco before he spoke. I can quite understand that, he said calmly. And Irishmen must think like that, I dare say. We feel in England that we have treated you rather unfairly. It seems history is to blame. The proud, potent titles clanged over Stephen's memory the triumph of their brazen bells. Et unam sanctum Catholicam et Apostolicam Ecclesiam. The slow growth and change of rite and dogma, like his own rare thoughts, a chemistry of stars. Symbol of the apostles in the Mass for Pope Marcellus. The voices blended, singing alone loud in affirmation, and behind their chant the vigilant angel of the church militant disarmed and menaced her heresiarchs. A horde of heresies fleeing with meters awry. Photius and the brood of mockers, of whom Mulligan was one, and Arius, warring his life long upon the consubstantiality of the Son with the Father, and Valentine, spurning Christ's terrene body, and the subtle African heresiarch Sabellius, who held that the Father himself was himself his own Son. Father was himself his own Son. Words Mulligan had spoken a moment since, in mockery to the stranger. Idle mockery. The void awaits surely all them that weave the mind. A menace, a disarming, and a worsting from those embattled angels of the church, Michael's host, who defend her ever in the hour of conflict with their lances and their shields. Hear, hear, prolonged applause. Zut, nom de Dieu. Of course, I'm a Britisher, Haynes' voice said, and I feel as one. I don't want to see my country fall into the hands of German Jews, either. That's our national problem, I'm afraid, just now. 2 men stood at the verge of the cliff, watching. Businessman, boatman. She's making for Bullock Harbor. The boatman nodded towards the north of the bay with some disdain. There's 5 fathoms out there, he said. It'll be swept up that way when the tide comes in about 1. It's 9 days today. The man that was drowned, a sail veering about the blank bay, waiting for a swollen bundle to bob up, roll over to the sun a puffy face, salt white. Here I am. They followed the winding path down to the creek. Buck Mulligan stood on the stone, in shirt sleeves, his unclipped tie rippling over his shoulder. A young man clinging to a spur of rock near him moved slowly frog-wise, his green legs in the deep jelly of the water. Is the brother with you, Malachi? Down in Westmeath, with the Bannons. Still here? I got a card from Bannon. Says he found a sweet young thing down there. Photo girl, he calls her. Snapshot, eh? Brief exposure. Buck Mulligan sat down to unlace his boots. An elderly man shot up near the spur of rock, a glowing red face. He scrambled up by the stones, water glistening on his pate, and on its garland of gray hair, water rilling over his chest and paunch, and spilling jets out of his black, sagging loincloth. Buck Mulligan made way for him to scramble past, and, glancing at Haynes and Stephen, crossed himself piously with his thumbnail at brow and breastbone. Seymour's back in town, the young man said, grasping again his spur of rock. Chucked medicine and going in for the army. Ah, go to God, Buck Mulligan said. Going over next week to Stew. You know that Red Carlisle girl? Lily? Yes, spooning with him last night on the pier. The father is rotten with money. Is she up the pole? Better ask Seymour that. Seymour, bleeding officer, Buck Mulligan said. He nodded to himself as he drew off his trousers and stood up, saying tritely, "Red-headed women buck like goats." He broke off in alarm, feeling his side under his flapping shirt. "My 12th rib is gone," he cried. "I'm the Ubermensch. Toothless Kinchinai, the Superman." He struggled out of his shirt and flung it behind him to where his clothes lay. "Are you going in here, Malachi?" "Yes, make room in the bed." The young man shoved himself backward through the water and reached the middle of the creek in 2 long, clean strokes. Haynes sat down on a stone, smoking. "Are you not coming in?" Buck Mulligan asked. "Later on," Haynes said. "Not on my breakfast." Stephen turned away. "I'm going, Mulligan," he said. "Give us that key, Kinch," Buck Mulligan said, "to keep my chemise flat." Stephen handed him the key. Buck Mulligan laid it across his heaped clothes. "And 2 pence," he said, "for a pint. Throw it there." Stephen threw 2 pennies on the soft heap. Dressing, undressing. Buck Mulligan, erect, with joined hands before him, said solemnly, "He who stealeth from the poor lendeth to the Lord. Thus spake Zarathustra." His plump body plunged. "We'll see you again," Haynes said, turning as Stephen walked up the path and smiling at Wild Irish. Horn of a bull, hoof of a horse, smile of a Saxon. "The ship," Buck Mulligan cried. "half-12. "Good," Stephen said. He walked along the upward curving path. "Liliata rutilantium, turma circumdet, jubilantium te virginum." The priest's grey nimbus in a niche where he dressed discreetly. "I will not sleep here tonight. Home also I cannot go." A voice, sweetened and sustained, called to him from the sea. Turning the curve, he waved his hand. It called again. A sleek brown head, a seal's, far out on the water, round. "Usurper."